On this Monday night, what's in store for Hudson's Bay? The possible demise of Canada's oldest retailer.
So it'll be sad to see an icon disappear like that.
The jobs on the line and when the Bay will stop accepting gift cards, plus the role it played in Canada's creation. Another discovery in a Manitoba landfill. Vindication for the family of a murdered Indigenous woman. Canada's Prime Minister on his first foreign trip. Mark Carney meets a president, a king, and a prime minister. The message he's sending.
We can stand up for ourselves.
And the alliances, he says, need strengthening. And containing a contagion.
We may have forgotten how serious these childhood infectious diseases are.
How easily measles spreads and who is most vulnerable.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. There is likely a big change coming to the retail landscape of Canada. Hudson's Bay, a company created in 1670, is now on life support. Lawyers for the retailer were in court today seeking permission to begin liquidation sales as early as this week. The judge held off on making a ruling, saying he wants more time to digest the issues. The hearing he presided over attracted so many lawyers, media, and observers that an overflow room had to be opened for spectators. Heidi Petracek looks at what's at stake in our top story tonight.
Outside the Bay's flagship stores, the news an end of an era could be near has shoppers thinking back.
I always used to shop at the Bay, and it's been a kind of an icon, hasn't it?
I've been going to the Bay with my grandma since I was a little kid, so it'll be sad to see an icon disappear like that.
Aren't they beautiful?
The possibility its doors could close, compelling regular shoppers like Judy Lewandowski to drop in while they still can.
I love the Bay. I thought I'd come in and just get one more pair of shoes for a really good buy.
Around for more than 3 centuries, from the fur trade to the days of anchor department stores, COVID-19 shutdowns, online shopping, and affordability concerns have led to tough times.
I've saw it for years. The dip, you could drop a bomb in there, nobody get hurt.
This is a sad story, but it's the evolution of retailing.
The store has gone through rebrands from the Hudson's Bay Company to the Bay and now simply HBC.
But unfortunately, the market wouldn't go there with them. You think you control your brand. The truth is, the market controls your brand.
Unable to cover its bills, now the company hopes a court will approve its plan to liquidate inventory and find a buyer. In the meantime, the company says it plans to stop accepting gift cards after April 6th. It had already paused its customer loyalty program, leaving more than 8 million shoppers stuck with almost $59 million in unused reward points. More than 80 stores and 9,000 jobs potentially affected. The Bay hasn't been Canadian-owned in years. Its current owner is an American investment firm that purchased the company in 2008. But Canadians still feel nostalgic about the stores.
It was part of a Canadian institution, but I guess the way things are now, no more.
Once the place for Canadians to shop, the iconic retailer now faces a chance it could become a thing of the past. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Dartmouth, Nova Scotia.
The Bay has a lot of retail space across this country. Our senior business correspondent, Anne Gaviola, is looking at what might happen to those locations. Anne.
Donna, the Bay is set to vacate what are known as anchor spots in malls across the country. That's a large retail footprint and not easy to fill. Remember that Hudson's Bay was bought in 2008 by NRDC Partners. That's a U.S. private investment firm. It was publicly listed, then taken private in 2020 by American businessman Richard Baker and a group of shareholders. So they own some of those properties and lease some of them. What's happening now is JLL, which is a global real estate firm, is tasked with monetizing the properties to pay creditors. Analysts tell me that realistically, those spaces will likely be divided and turned into stores for retailers from around the world. Now, because of their large footprint and prime locations, you may actually see new uses for the space, including car dealerships or redevelopment into condominiums, hotels, or temporary pop-up seasonal markets, community or concert venues. Donna?
All right, and Gaviola in Toronto, thank you. There is news out of Manitoba about that search of the Prairie Green landfill. A second set of human remains has been found, and they've been identified as those of Marcedes Myran. She was one of 4 Indigenous women murdered by a serial killer in 2022. Melissa Ridgen is following this story for us. Melissa.
Donna, the push to search a landfill outside of Winnipeg for the remains of 3 murdered Indigenous women took years. But in just days, 2 families have gotten answers. Today, police are identifying the remains of Marcedes Myran. They were discovered at the Prairie Green landfill outside of Winnipeg last month. This follows the identification of Morgan Harris, whose remains were found at the same landfill 10 days ago. Myran and Harris were both from the Long Plain First Nation, just west of Winnipeg. Last week, Harris's daughter said she felt certain that both the Myrans and her family would have closure on this. And today, Myran's family has asked for privacy as they get a grip on that. But Manitoba's Premier Wab Kinew, who made the search for the landfill an election promise, said that the search was always the right thing to do.
Marcedes Myran and Morgan Harris are coming home. I hope that Manitobans and Canadians believe that this reflects positively on our province and on our country. We went through a whole heck of a lot to get to this point, but at the end of the day, we did the right thing.
The Manitoba and federal governments put up $40 million to look for Harris, Myran, and possibly a third unidentified woman who elders have called Buffalo Woman. The search for that third woman continues. Myran and Harris are both believed to have been killed in May 2022 by Jeremy Skibicki. Last summer, he received 4 life sentences for their murders and the killing of Rebecca Contois, whose remains were found by police. So this marks a significant chapter in a story reaching back several years, Donna, one that is still being felt today.
All right, Melissa Ridgen in Winnipeg, thank you.
I want to ensure that France and the whole of Europe works enthusiastically with Canada, the most European of non-European countries.
We don't need another country to validate our sovereignty.
That is Canada's new Prime Minister in Paris and then London on his first overseas trip. He was welcomed by the leaders of France and the UK, and he met King Charles at Buckingham Palace. Carney says Canada's trade and security relationships are too focused on the US right now, and this trip to Europe is the start of his efforts to change that. Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stephenson is traveling with the Prime Minister.
The body language sent a clear message of why Prime Minister Mark Carney chose France and the UK for his first trip abroad. Safe choices where he knew he would find friends and shore up alliances. Carney's first stop in Paris was a symbolic one. The iconic Notre Dame Cathedral, rebuilt with Europe and America's cooperation. Meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron, the clear theme was the need for more cooperation in a time of global instability.
Canada is a reliable, trustworthy, and strong partner of France, which shares our values and lives them through action during this age of economic and geopolitical crises.
And while U.S. President Donald Trump was never mentioned, he cast a shadow over the discussion. Macron spoke of shared values of sovereignty and solidarity, but did not explicitly address Trump's bombastic rhetoric. Carney was enthusiastic for more European-Canadian cooperation, but was careful not to inflame the White House.
I'd like you to maintain the most positive possible relations with the United States. Your Majesty.
In London, Carney met with King Charles, who has expressed his support for Canada in recent days in a subdued way. And the Prime Minister sat down with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
Two sovereign allies, so much in common, shared history, shared values, shared king.
In a press conference, he announced his trip to be a success.
The Prime Minister made a point of referring to our sovereignty, made a point of referring to our shared sovereign.
Despite the warm and fuzzy nature of this trip, what's been missing is any kind of official declarations or agreements, measurable successes, pledges going forward, or an explicit defense of Canada's sovereignty against Donald Trump's threats to make Canada the 51st state. Because most of the discussions happened behind closed doors, we don't know what progress was made in terms of trying to move forward on free trade agreements or on defense agreements, especially the F-35, an American-produced fighter jet that Mark Carney is having reviewed, something the French might be keen to sell us their product on. Donna?
All right, Mercedes Stephenson in London, thanks. There's a new projection of how quickly the American president's aggressive trade policies could slow growth around the world, especially in Canada and Mexico. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development expects economic growth to shrink by 3.1% globally, and it projects growth in Canada will slow to 0.7% in 2025 and 2026. That's down from 1.5% in 2024. And it projects Mexico will fall into recession. Canada's federal Conservative leader is taking another swipe at existing environmental policies. Pierre Poilievre now says if he becomes Prime Minister, he will eliminate carbon pricing on greenhouse gas emissions that large industrial emitters pay. It's widely accepted making them pay for the pollution they create will be the biggest driver in reducing emissions in this country between now and 2030. Mackenzie Gray looks at why Poilievre thinks it's a good idea to scrap it.
It's the topic Pierre Poilievre is desperate to have an election over.
Conservative government will repeal the entire carbon tax, including the federal backstop that requires provinces impose industrial taxes.
After 2 years of questioning, the Conservative leader finally saying he would remove the industrial carbon tax levied against Canada's largest producers, which according to the Canadian Climate Institute represents 42% of national emissions. Poilievre's replacement?
We will expand eligibility for the clean technology and clean manufacturing investment tax credits.
But tax credits have proven to be considerably less effective, which according to the Canadian Climate Institute is responsible for only 3% of Canada's emissions decrease.
He's taking the hard-earned money of Canadian taxpayers and giving it to some of the wealthiest companies, the biggest polluters in the country.
The current industrial cap-and-trade program is responsible for up to 48% of emissions cuts, which allows an oil company that emits fewer greenhouse gases to receive federally issued carbon credits that it can sell to companies that emit more than the federal limit, giving cash to greener companies and incentives for bigger polluters to cut emissions.
Just to make it easy to get our heads around it, 6 million homes or 15 million cars off the road.
Mark Carney's first move was to cut the consumer carbon tax to $0, and he's promised to revamp the industrial carbon tax.
It's ultimately a trick.
Poilievre, who only took questions from hand-picked news organizations Monday, would not commit to any emissions targets.
We will use technology. Technology, not taxes, is the best way to fight climate change and protect our environment.
The Conservatives are doubling down on the carbon tax, Donna, but it doesn't seem to be resonating with Canadians, as a new poll from Angus Reid has the Liberals 5 points ahead of the Tories, verging on majority territory.
Okay, Mackenzie Gray, thank you. The Kremlin has confirmed Vladimir Putin will speak with the U.S. president tomorrow about the war in Ukraine. According to Donald Trump, dividing territory and certain assets will be on the agenda. Ukrainians fear the two leaders could make a deal on how to carve up the country. Redmond Shannon reports.
Video released by Russia's defense ministry claims to show abandoned equipment in Russia's Kursk region after the retreat of Ukrainian forces. A Russian soldier shows off Ukrainian arms he says come from NATO members, including the US. US President Donald Trump resumed the supply of arms to Ukraine last week after Kyiv agreed to a 30-day truce proposal, a plan Russia said would need major changes.
Those conditions that they have presented, it shows that they don't really want peace, because they are presenting as conditions all their ultimate goals that they want to achieve from the war.
I'll be speaking to President Putin on Tuesday.
On Monday, the Kremlin confirmed the leaders would talk. But unlike Trump, Russia wouldn't detail any topics.
And we'll be talking about land, we'll be talking about power plants. That's a big question. We're already talking about that, dividing up certain assets.
U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz says Ukraine will need to cede land if it wants future security guarantees from the U.S. Ominous words for many in Ukraine.
The fact that they are pressuring us to give up our territories. I'm sorry, I have two brothers there. What are they fighting for?
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says no decision about Ukraine's future can be made without Ukraine at the table. He spoke with new Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on Sunday, raising the topic of financial sanctions against Russia with the former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England. Donna?
Redmond, thanks. Coming up, how mass deportations in the U.S. are creating a constitutional crisis. In the U.S., a federal judge has begun a hearing to examine whether the Trump administration defied a federal court order by deporting hundreds of people it claims are Venezuelan gang members. As Jackson Prosco reports, they were flown to El Salvador and Honduras under the Alien Enemies Act, an 18th century law.
In shackles and under heavy guard, more than 200 deportees were flown from the U.S. to El Salvador, transported to a remote mega prison where they were locked away in a jarring display of President Donald Trump's immigration crackdown.
These were bad people. That was a bad group of, as I say, hombres. That was a bad group.
The Trump administration alleges most of the men are members of a Venezuelan gang, Tren de Aragua, which Trump has declared a terrorist organization. Now the White House is invoking an obscure wartime law to ramp up the deportations. The Alien Enemies Act of 1798 was last used to intern Japanese Americans during the Second World War.
This is a time of war because Biden allowed millions of people, many of them criminals, many of them at the highest level.
Civil liberties groups argue the men were deported without due process.
These individuals must be given an opportunity to show that they are not members of the gang.
And now it's verging on a constitutional crisis. Sunday, with the planes already in the air, a judge issued a temporary restraining order and ordered the flights to turn back. They continued anyway.
This administration acted within the confines of the law, again, within the president's constitutional authority.
It's a test of how far the new administration will go to defy the courts. If the deportations continue, legal experts warn of potentially disturbing consequences.
Because there's no way to understand who's being picked up and there's no process here, I feel confident that eventually, if they keep doing this, the U.S. citizen is going to be deported in this way. And I think that's something everyone should be concerned about.
Trump shows no sign of backing down. The U.S. is paying El Salvador $6 million to imprison the deportees and has promised to keep sending more to this notorious prison in the jungle. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
Health warning ahead. Measles cases in parts of Canada climb. Public health officials in Canada are sounding the alarm about the spread of measles. The first 3 months of this year have had the highest number of cases in decades. Ontario has had multiple cases. And now, as Heather Yorks-West explains, Western provinces are seeing a surge in measles as well.
Visitors to Edmonton's Stollery Children's Hospital over the weekend have received a public health alert after being exposed to measles in the hospital's ER.
Most of the people, like my circle and family and friends, they all took that vaccination.
As one of the most effective vaccines, those fully immunized have little to fear. But within the un- and under-immunized, measles can spread with frightening speed. In recent days, health officials have reported other exposures across the prairies, a possible indication the outbreak that has taken hold in Ontario is heading west.
We haven't seen this level of spread, certainly not since before measles was eliminated in Canada in 1998.
There are now more than 300 confirmed and probable cases in Ontario and 36 in Quebec, while BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba have all reported new cases in recent weeks.
We know measles is the most contagious infectious disease we know.
So contagious that measles can be caught simply by visiting the same area as an infectious person, even hours after they've left. If vaccine levels dip below 75% in a community, outbreaks can very quickly spin out of control.
Below that, you do start to see, maybe 10 or 20 or 30% of a community will end up with measles if that vaccination rate is lower, like in the 60s or 70%.
In 2024, 82% of Canadians had at least one dose of measles vaccine. But in some communities, coverage drops much lower. The unimmunized public health officials say, like kindling to an advancing flame, if measles should arrive in town. Heather Yorks-West, Global News, Calgary.
Going back in time, why the Hudson's Bay Company is such a foundation of Canada. Shoppers who love the Bay are mourning what appears to be its imminent demise. But the history of the Hudson's Bay Company is much deeper than a retail or business story. The company is intertwined with Canada's founding. It goes back centuries to a time when the fur trade was everything. Mike Armstrong has this look at the Bay's history and how it shaped our country.
This is early film of Canada's fur trading industry. Early because in 1920, film was relatively new, fur trading was not. The film was shot by the Hudson's Bay Company to celebrate its 250th anniversary. Now, the Hudson's Bay Company was founded in 1670. At the time, much of the eastern part of the continent was, as it's sometimes called, beavered out. They'd been hunted or trapped to the point there just weren't enough around. The pursuit of the beaver pushed settlers west. The company was pitched by French explorers, Hudson and des Groseilliers, but backed by British financiers. The company was given control over all the rivers and streams that flowed into Hudson Bay, hence the name, about 40% of Canada today. Now, why? Well, beaver pelts were very valuable in Europe, used for clothing and hats. The fur is warm, waterproof, and moldable. For the first part of its existence, the company was small. It ran trading posts, employing in total only about 500 Europeans. Unlike New France, it wasn't separate from the Indigenous groups it was trading with, but integrated with those around them. Historian Stephen Brown.
The company was its own unique culture, a blending of all these peoples and the customs and ideas, and it had to be, or it wouldn't have been accepted in those lands.
Now, that started to change in the late 1700s. Diseases brought to North America decimated Indigenous populations. Faced with fewer traders, the company pushed further west, eventually all the way to the Pacific. When the United States tried to take over the West, the British claim to the region was the Hudson's Bay Company. It turned the land over to Canada.
We live in the world that they created.
Brown says Hudson's Bay may have been a commercial enterprise, but in many ways it founded, shaped, and built a political one. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
That is Global National for this Monday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada showcases Golden Prairie, Saskatchewan, Minden, Ontario, and Ypres, Alberta. Keep them coming to Global National at globalnews.ca. And thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.